Hello, welcome to Talking the Secret Doctrine. My name is Dr. Don Franklin Shepherd, and today we are going to continue our study of the first volume of H.P. Blavatsky's The Secret Doctrine, in particular on pages 368 to pages 374 under the title The Days and Nights of Brahma. We will once again be using H.P. Blavatsky's The Secret Doctrine, published by Theosophical University Press, published out at Pasadena, California. These pages are dealing with the Mahamanvantara of 311 trillion 40 billion years. And H.P. Blavatsky is looking at how the central point tinctures the seventh layer of the mundane egg, which then infills the solar systems with its energies. And then upon the ending of the life of the sevenfold mundane egg, how those energies retreat back up from the lowest layer, the first, all the way up to the seventh of the mundane egg and back to the central point. Let's go ahead and take a look at what Blavatsky says about this subject. If one looks at page 368, in the third paragraph there, this is what she writes. One pararda, in the ordinary acceptation of this measure of time, or half of the existence of Brahma in the present Mahakalpa has already expired. So if a Mahakalpa or a Mahamanvantara is 311 trillion years long, H.P. Blavatsky has just told us that half of it has expired. That means we have lived 155 trillion years approximately in this Mahamanvantara. That's where we are. We started at the top. We've gone down 155 trillion years, and now we're just coming up. She continues with this theme on page 369 on the first paragraph, in the middle of that paragraph, on the middle of the page. She writes, not even esoteric philosophy can claim to know, except by analogical inference, that which took place before the reappearance of our solar system and previous to the last Mahapralaya. So we know that we've got 155 trillion years of evolution going down. What Blavatsky is referring to here is the 311 trillion year Mahapralaya preceding this 155 year evolutionary descent in the new Mahamanvantara. So what she's saying is that only by analogical inference can we argue what happened prior to hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of trillions of years ago in the last Mahamanvantara. She's dealing with really large cycles in this section on the days and nights of Brahma. She's dealing with the cycles of that central point, which tinctures the seventh layer of the mundane egg. If we go ahead and turn the page over on 371 at the very top in that first paragraph, she lays out the fact that this Mahamanvantara can be titled a Prakritika Pralaya. But it's important to remember that a Prakritika Pralaya is partial, it's not complete. And so what she does on that page 371 is she's trying to set up a hierarchy for how the life forms go back from this lowest layer of the material world, this lowest layer of the mundane egg, the first layer of the mundane egg, on the death of the sevenfold mundane egg, and retreats back up through the first, the second, the third, the fourth layers, the layer of the solar suns, the fifth, the sixth, the seventh, and on upwards. This is what she writes. There is a Prakritika Pralaya, and it occurs at the end of the age or life of Brahma, where everything that exists is resolved into the primal element to be remodeled at the end of that longer night. So here we have these layers of the mundane enfolding themselves at the lowest layer of the mundane egg into the primal element, which in this case we can look at as the more material side of Swabhava, the seventh layer of the mundane egg. And it's remodeled at the end of the longer night. And in this case, the longer night is the 311 trillion year Mahapralaya. So we have 155 trillion year descent, we have 155 trillion year ascent, then we have this longer night of the 311 trillion year Mahapralaya. And she makes reference to this when she's talking about freed Jivan Muktis who can go into Nirvana. And this is what she writes about that. that an individual can reach in which no more future existence is possible, no rebirth until after the Mahapralaya. The latter night, lasting as it does 311 trillion, 40 billion years, and having the possibility of being almost doubled in the case of the lucky Jivan Mukti, who reaches nirvana at an early period of a manvantara, is long enough to be regarded as eternal, if not endless. So someone who goes into nirvana early in the Mahamanvantara can also then spend a great period of time in the Mahamanvantara in nirvana, as well as spending time in nirvana in the Mahapralaya. The compassionate Buddhas reject much of this, and they choose to remain here behind to help their fellow travelers on the weary path upwards. H.P. Blavatsky continues with this theme. She now wants to show how, with the dissolution of the sevenfold universe, how from the lowest layer of the mundane egg, 1 to 2 to 3 to 4 to 5 to 6 to 7, how these unroll themselves and then enwrap themselves back on the journey upwards. And I think to understand the next passages in H.P. Blavatsky, one could take a brief look at Jita Purwakar's Fundamentals of the Esoteric Philosophy on page 462, where he lays out the 7 lokas. So the 7 lokas are the 7 layers of the mundane egg from a very simple perspective. He shows on page 462 that Burloka corresponds to the first layer, Bhuvarloka corresponds to the second layer, Svarloka corresponds to the third layer, Maharloka corresponds to the fourth layer of the mundane egg, Janarloka corresponds to the 5th layer, Taparloka corresponds to the 6th layer, and Satyaloka corresponds to the 7th layer. And the significance of understanding that is that we now have the hierarchical breakdown for understanding what H.P. Blavatsky writes on page 371 when she talks about the Mahapralaya ensuing. Here's what she writes in the second paragraph. When the Mahapralaya arrives, the inhabitants of Svarloka, the upper sphere, disturbed by the conflagration, seek refuge with the Pitris, their progenitors, the Manus, the 7 Rishis, the various orders of celestial spirits, and the gods in Maharloka. So from looking at Jita Purwakar, we now understand that this Svarloka is the 3rd layer of the mundane egg. Now, we in our physical universe are in Burloka, Bhuvarloka above us, Svarloka is the 3rd layer. So what H.P. Blavatsky is saying here in this first sentence is that the Mahapralaya affects the inhabitants of Svarloka. It affects Burloka, it affects Bhuvarloka, it affects Svarloka. And the inhabitants of Svarloka have to retreat upwards into Maharloka. Maharloka being the 4th, and in a certain way, Maharloka corresponding to the inner nature of the solar suns. She continues, when the latter is reached also, the whole of the above enumerated beings migrate in their turn from Maharloka and repair to Janarloka in their subtle forms, destined to become re-embodied in similar capacities as their former, when the world is renewed at the beginning of the succeeding kalpa. So here we have the entities in Maharloka. So we can call this a plane relatively corresponding to an aspect of the inner nature of the solar suns, and that nature has to retreat upwards. So the solar suns are being affected. The solar suns in this case also being gods. Those gods are being affected in the Mahamanvantara. They have to retreat upwards from Maharloka, the 4th layer of the mundane egg, to, in this case, Janarloka, the 5th layer of the mundane egg. And we know Janarloka is corresponding to Raja suns. It's corresponding to a type of sun that is higher than our solar suns. So we see what's being affected by this Mahapralaya. She continues on the next passage. She writes, these clouds, mighty in size and loud in thunder, fill up all space. Well, these clouds are referring to this 5th layer of Janarloka. It's a mystery reference. It's a mystery reference. It's a secret reference. One finds it in Aristophanes, but these clouds, in a way, correspond to the Manasaputras. They correspond to that fifth layer of the human being. And here, through correspondence, they also correspond to that fifth layer of the mundane egg. Goes on to Vishnu Purana, showering down torrents of water, these clouds quench the dreadful fires, and then they rain uninterrupted for 100 divine years and deluge the whole world's solar system. So the solar systems, as the fourth, as Maharloka, are underneath Janarloka, where the clouds are. So the fifth layer, the fourth layer is being destroyed, while those entities are up in the fifth, doing whatever they do, whatever activities one does in the fifth layer. She continues on. Pouring down in drops as large as dice, these rains overspread the earth and fill the middle region, the Bhuvarloka. Again, that's the second layer of the mundane egg. So it's knocking out this astral structure behind the physical structure of the mundane egg and inundate heaven. The world is now enveloped in darkness, and all things animate or inanimate having perished, the clouds continue to pour down these waters. So everything's enveloped in darkness because those fifth layer energies are knocking out everything below it, and ultimately that fifth layer is going to be prevented from going up higher as the sixth layer protects that entity that's dying in the seventh layer. And the night of Brahma reigns supreme over the scene of desolation. So what she's just done is she said, look, we've got a sevenfold mundane egg. The first layer, the second layer, the third layer, the fourth layer are being enwrapped. They're being enwrapped in destruction from the fifth layer. And then she's basically pointing out that the fifth layer, the sixth layer, and the seventh layer of the mundane egg have their own processes. But she doesn't delineate exactly what these processes are because these are part of the teachings of the mystery school. It applies to the human being and the way human being journeys are discussed after death. And it also applies here to the sevenfold mundane egg. She continues, this is what we call in the Eso Doctrine a solar pralaya. Now, yes, a solar pralaya overlaps and would happen at the same time as the great Mahamanvantaric pralaya that comes at the end of the Mahamanvantara, the Mahapralaya. The suns obviously will come to an end. In another way, with the word solar pralaya, she's also pointing out the fact that she is dividing the lower four levels of the mundane egg and the upper three levels of the mundane egg at the close of a Mahamanvantara. She continues, when the waters have reached the region of the seven rishis and the world, our solar system, is one ocean, they stop. So the seven rishis, corresponding to that third layer of the mundane egg, our solar system, corresponding to the fourth layer of the mundane egg, and then the water stops. So the first, the second, the third, the fourth layers of the mundane egg have been destroyed. This is why Prakritika Pralaya means partial, because she's laying out these partial destructions of the various layers of the mundane egg. She continues, the breath of Vishnu becomes a strong wind, which blows for another 100 years until the clouds are dispersed. The wind is then reabsorbed. The wind is reabsorbed. The fifth layer is reabsorbed into the sixth layer. The wind is corresponding to the fifth layer, and it's reabsorbed upwards into the sixth layer. So now she's showing that second division of what's going on in the fifth, the sixth, and the seventh layers of the mundane egg, now that she's shown that the first four layers have been destroyed. The wind is then reabsorbed. That's that darkness of space that protects the dying entity, so the dying entity can be alone and go on his journeys. And that, with a capital T-H-A-T, of which all things are made, the Lord by whom all things exist, he who is inconceivable, without beginning, the beginning of the universe, reposes, sleeping upon Sesha, the serpent of infinity, in the midst of the deep. Beautiful thoughts here. Let's go ahead and see how H.P. Blavatsky closes up these thoughts on page 373 at the very top in the first paragraph. The primary element, consciousness, we're now dealing with Swabhava. Now, in this case, in its more intellectual aspect, combined with tamasa, spiritual darkness, That's going to be, in this case, technically the sixth, the matter side of the sixth layer of the mundane egg, is itself disintegrated by Mahat, the universal intellect whose characteristic property is buddhi. And Earth and Mahat are the inner and outer boundaries of the universe. So what is going on here? Well, let's explain it. The primary element, consciousness, so here we're dealing with Swabhavat, combined with Tamasa, spiritual darkness. It's not really spiritually dark. It's a very high layer of spiritual intelligence. But compared to the primary element, as we're dropping down, it's considered spiritual darkness, just as Mula Prakriti is spiritual darkness to Para Brahman. Is itself disintegrated by Mahat, the universal intellect. So what is Mahat here? Well, here, as we've discussed before, Mahat is actually threefold in the secret doctrine. Mahat is the seventh layer of the mundane egg. Mahat is the sixth layer of the mundane egg. Mahat is the fifth layer of the mundane egg. And so here we're dealing with the universal intellect, universal referring to the seventh layer, intellect describing the drop of divine thought into the fifth layer of the mundane egg. So we know we're dealing with Mahat as a stream here, whose characteristic property is buddhi, because buddhi is the sixth layer of the mundane egg. So we know Mahat's dropping from the seventh to the sixth. That's why she calls it its characteristic to the fifth. And Earth and Mahat are the inner and outer boundaries of the universe. And so we know that Mahat in the seventh, sixth, and fifth stages are the boundaries of this upper part of the sevenfold mundane egg. And the Earth, remember the Earth is, when we look at H.P. Blavatsky in the second volume, page 241, these planets are the first, second, and third layers of the mundane egg working upwards. In the middle, we have the medium point, the fourth layer, the solar suns, which balance what's going on. And so we have Mahat as the seventh, sixth, and fifth. We have our Earth, figuratively, the first, second, and the third going up, balanced by the fourth, which refers to the solar suns. And so in a certain way, we can call all of this a solar pralaya, even though it's actually referring to a Mahamanvantara. It's beautifully veiled. She's done a remarkable job. It's such a beautiful passage that she writes here. Let's continue. Thus, as in the beginning were the seven forms of Prakriti, nature, reckoned from Mahat to Earth, so these seven successively re-enter each other. Finally, at the very bottom of page 373, in the last paragraph, she sums it up. This is what she writes. This is the final pralaya, the death of cosmos, after which its spirit rests in nirvana, or in that for which there is neither day nor night. So we're dealing with this huge cycle. So on the one hand, she can refer to it as a solar pralaya. On the other hand, we can also see it as this death of cosmos. Something's going on with the sevenfold mundane egg and that living concretized entity moving upwards into the upper three logoi. All the other pralayas are periodical and follow in regular succession, the manvantaras, as the night follows the day of every human creature, animal, and plant. The cycle of creation of the lives of cosmos, again spelled with a K, so we know we're dealing with the sevenfold mundane egg and the upper three logoi, is run down. The energy of the manifested word, having its growth, culmination, and decrease, as have all things temporary, however long their duration. So the word here is referring to that combination of the third logos, the central point, to that living concretized energy, that consciousness in the seventh layer of the mundane egg. She goes on, the creative force is eternal as noumenon, as a phenomenal manifestation in its aspects. It has a beginning and must therefore have an end. During that interval, it has its periods of activity and its periods of rest, and these are the days and the nights of Brahma. But Brahma, the noumenon, never rests, as it never changes and never is, though it cannot be said to be anywhere. So we have to keep in mind that when we're dealing with that unknown potentiality, in some way leading to the activation of the central point to become the active central point, which then tinctures the seventh layer of the mundane egg, and bringing about that concretized energy of consciousness at the head of the sevenfold mundane egg, we must remember that the central point potentially is always the central point. Potentially. It's always united with the Immaculate White Disk. The potentiality of the Immaculate White Disk can never disappear. So there's these mysterious processes going on within the immaculate white disk as a central point activates into what we think of as the manifested central point. So she makes clear that it is this manifested word. What is a manifested word? The manifested word is the latent nothing, that central point potentially, becoming the active central point, tincturing the concretized living entity in the sevenfold mundane egg. This is the manifested word. It's this combination, this relationship between the active central point and the seventh layer of the mundane egg. It is this that is dying. It is this that is changing. It is this, at the close of 311 trillion year Mahamanvantara, is going back up into its previous state, into that state of the potentiality, which in fact never changes, of the central point in the immaculate white disk as the first logos. There's a lot to think about here. It's really amazing what H.P. Blavatsky has done here, and she's on one hand she's revealed so much of what's going on at the close of a 311 trillion year cycle, and yet at the same time making sure that she's veiled the exact periods and the exact processes for all of this happens. Thank you so much. See you again.